It was a quiet night in the Thompson household. The old grandfather clock in the living room chimed midnight, its echo faintly reaching the nursery. Emma stirred in her sleep, half awake but unsure why. Then, she heard it again, a low, tense growl cutting through the silence. Her heart quickened. Bruno, the loyal golden retriever, had always been a gentle soul, never once showing a hint of aggression. Since baby Noah was born, Bruno had become his silent guardian, sleeping by the crib, always watchful. But tonight, something was different. Emma slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Brian, and tiptoed toward the nursery. As she neared the door, the growling grew more distinct. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, almost as if Bruno was warning of something unseen. She stepped into the dimly lit room. The soft glow of the nightlight cast shadows on the walls, and there, beside Noah's crib, sat Bruno. His ears were pricked forward, his body rigid, and his golden fur bristled slightly as he let out another deep, rumbling growl. Emma's breath hitched. "What's wrong, boy?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Bruno didn't turn to look at her. His eyes were locked onto Noah, staring with an unsettling intensity. Emma glanced at her son. His tiny chest rose and fell steadily, his little fingers curled into loose fists. He was perfectly fine. Then why was Bruno acting this way? Worried, she crouched beside the dog, gently placing a hand on his back. His muscles were tense beneath her touch. When she whispered his name again, he finally shifted his gaze to her, but only for a second before snapping his attention back to the crib. A shiver ran down her spine. Maybe he saw something outside? She turned toward the window, but the curtains were drawn, the neighborhood still and silent. There was no sign of movement, no eerie shadows dancing against the glass. Bruno let out another quiet growl. A sudden wave of unease gripped Emma. Her logical mind told her there was nothing there, but an instinct, buried deep in her gut, whispered otherwise. Something wasn't right. She reached for Bruno's collar, gently pulling him away. He resisted at first, his paws planted firmly against the wooden floor, but eventually relented as she led him out of the room. As she closed the nursery door behind her, she exhaled, trying to shake off the lingering unease. It was just a fluke. Bruno was probably restless. Maybe he was adjusting to a new routine. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. The next morning, Emma sat at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee in front of her. But she barely touched it. Across from her, Brian scrolled through his phone, oblivious to the storm of thoughts raging inside her mind. She had barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Bruno's tense body, heard that low, unsettling growl. She finally cleared her throat. "Something's wrong with Bruno." Brian looked up, raising an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" Emma hesitated, trying to find the right words. Last night, he was growling at Noah's crib. Not just once, over and over. Like he saw something. But there was nothing there, Brian. Nothing. Brian leaned back in his chair. Maybe he saw a shadow or heard a noise outside. She shook her head. "No. I checked everything." The window was shut, the curtains drawn. It wasn't just a quick reaction. He was staring at Noah, completely fixated. Brian sighed, rubbing his temples. "Emma, Bruno's a dog. He could have been restless, maybe had a bad dream." "A bad dream that made him act like that? Every night?" She crossed her arms. "It's not normal, Brian. And I don't like it." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the kitchen. Then, Emma stood abruptly. "I'm calling the vet." Later that afternoon, Emma drove Bruno to their trusted veterinarian, Dr. Mitchell. The old man had been caring for Bruno since he was a puppy, and if anyone could give them answers, it was him. Bruno sat obediently on the exam table as Dr. Mitchell checked his heart, ears, and eyes. The vet hummed thoughtfully as he finished his examination. "Well, I don't see anything physically wrong with him," he finally said, removing his stethoscope. "His heart rate is normal, his reflexes are good, and his eyes are clear. No sign of pain or discomfort." Emma frowned. "So why is he acting so strangely?" Dr. Mitchell shrugged. "Dogs are incredibly intuitive. Sometimes they sense things we don't, changes in the environment, subtle shifts in behavior, even illnesses before they show symptoms." Emma's stomach twisted at that last part. "Illness? Are you saying something could be wrong with Noah? Dr. Mitchell gave a reassuring smile. I'm not saying that. But I wouldn't rule out the possibility that Bruno is picking up on something. Have you noticed any changes in Noah? Emma shook her head. No, he's perfectly fine. He sleeps well, eats well, he's a happy, healthy baby. The vet nodded. Then maybe he's reacting to something else. Have you considered checking your home for gas leaks? Carbon monoxide? Even electrical issues? Dogs can detect things we can't. The suggestion sent a chill through Emma. Gas leaks? Carbon monoxide? The thought of something dangerous lurking in their home, unnoticed, made her heart race. I'll call someone to check, she said firmly, standing up. I just want to be sure. Doctor. Mitchell patted Bruno's head. It's always better to be cautious. But for now, your boy here is as healthy as ever. That evening, a home inspector arrived with specialized equipment, scanning every room for gas leaks, carbon monoxide, and any signs of electrical issues. Emma and Brian anxiously followed him from room to room, watching as he checked the basement, the air vents, even the attic. Finally, after nearly an hour, the inspector shook his head. Everything's clean. No leaks, no faulty wiring. Your house is perfectly safe. Emma exhaled, both relieved and frustrated. Then what's wrong with Bruno? Brian placed a hand on her shoulder. Maybe we're overthinking it. The vet said he's fine, the house is fine. Maybe he's just being a dog. But Emma wasn't convinced. Because later that night, when the house was once again shrouded in darkness, and the steady rhythm of Noah's breathing filled the nursery, Bruno was there, sitting beside the crib, growling. And this time, it was even louder. The clock on the nightstand read 2:13 a.m. when Emma shot up in bed, her heart hammering in her chest. At first, she didn't know what had woken her. The house was silent except for Brian's steady breathing beside her. But then she heard it, Bruno barking. Not the usual low growl. Not the cautious, warning sound he had been making every night. This was different. Urgent. Frantic. Desperate. Emma threw off the covers and bolted down the hall, her bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor. The moment she reached Noah's nursery, she gasped. Bruno was pacing wildly beside the crib, his hackles raised, his tail stiff. He turned to Emma, his amber eyes burning with something she had never seen before, pure panic. Bruno, what? Before she could finish, Bruno lunged at her, grabbing the fabric of her pajama pants in his teeth and yanking her forward with surprising force. Emma stumbled, her pulse spiking in fear. Bruno had never acted aggressively before. Never. But he wasn't attacking her. He was pulling her toward Noah. And then she saw it. Noah. Lying in his crib. Silent. Her blood turned to ice. Too silent. Emma dropped to her knees, hands shaking as she reached for her son. She pressed her fingers to his tiny chest. No movement. No breath. Her body went cold. Brian! She screamed, her voice raw with terror. Footsteps thundered down the hallway as Brian burst into the room, disoriented and confused. What's wrong? Emma could barely breathe. Noah's not. Then, before she could finish, Bruno acted. He let out a deep, guttural growl and shoved his nose against Noah's tiny body. Once. Twice. Then, a third time, more forcefully. Emma barely had time to process what was happening before, suddenly, Noah gasped. A sharp, ragged inhale, his tiny mouth opening as his body jerked. Then came the cry. A wail so loud and piercing that Emma thought her heart might stop entirely. But she didn't care. Because Noah was breathing again. She clutched her baby to her chest, sobbing uncontrollably, rocking back and forth as Brian stood frozen, his face pale with shock. Bruno let out one last, relieved huff and sat down beside them, his watchful eyes never leaving Noah. The ambulance arrived within minutes. Emma sat in the back of it, holding Noah tightly against her chest as the paramedics checked his vitals. Brian sat beside her, gripping her hand so hard it hurt. Neither of them had spoken much since the paramedics arrived. There were no words. Just shock. Just fear. Just overwhelming, unbearable relief. At the hospital, after what felt like an eternity of tests, the doctor finally stepped into the room, clipboard in hand. Your son has infant sleep apnea, he said gently. It's a rare condition, but it can cause temporary pauses in breathing while sleeping. Some babies grow out of it, but in severe cases, It can be life-threatening if undetected. Emma felt like the floor had been pulled out from beneath her. Brian swallowed hard. So, if Bruno hadn't woken us up, the doctor nodded solemnly. Your dog saved your son's life tonight. Emma broke down. She had known Bruno was trying to tell them something. She had felt it in her bones. But she had never imagined that their loyal, loving dog had been the only thing standing between life and death for Noah. That night, when they finally returned home, Emma sat on the nursery floor, watching Noah sleep peacefully in his crib, now connected to a medical monitor. The steady beep reassured her that her son was safe. And lying beside the crib, curled protectively around its base, was Bruno. His job wasn't done, and Emma knew it never would be. The house felt different now. Even though the nursery was quiet, even though Noah was peacefully asleep in his crib, a weight hung in the air, a deep, unsettling realization that everything had nearly changed forever. Emma sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the steaming cup of coffee in her hands. She hadn't slept, not really. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw it again, Noah's tiny, motionless body. The terrifying silence, the feeling of sheer helplessness. Across from her, Brian was just as shaken. He rubbed a hand over his face and exhaled. I still can't wrap my head around it, he admitted. He just stopped breathing. Emma's grip tightened around the mug. And we never would have known if it weren't for Bruno. At the sound of his name, Bruno lifted his head from his spot beside the table. His golden fur was still ruffled from the long, exhausting night. But his eyes, those deep, intelligent, knowing eyes, remained watchful. Brian ran a hand through his hair. I keep thinking, what if we had ignored him? What if we had locked him out of the nursery? Emma's stomach twisted. Don't. Because the answer was too horrible to say out loud. Later that morning, they took Noah to see a pediatric specialist. The doctor, a kind-eyed man in his 50s, carefully examined their son before sitting them down in his office. Your baby has infant sleep apnea, he explained gently. It's a condition that causes pauses in breathing while sleeping. For some babies, it's mild and temporary. But in rare cases, it can be serious. Emma's breath caught in her throat. How serious? The doctor's face softened. Without intervention, Noah could have suffered severe oxygen deprivation. And in the worst-case scenario, he might not have woken up. Brian reached over, gripping Emma's hand tightly. She felt his fingers tremble. But he did wake up, Emma said, voice barely above a whisper. Because of Bruno. The doctor nodded, clearly moved. Yes. Your dog sensed something was wrong before anyone else did. That's remarkable. Emma blinked, trying to hold back tears. How is that even possible? Dogs have an extraordinary ability to detect changes in human physiology, the doctor explained. They can sense shifts in breathing, heart rate, even changes in body chemistry. Some dogs are trained as medical alert animals for conditions like seizures and diabetes. But others like Bruno just seem to know. Emma swallowed the lump in her throat. So, every night, when he was growling at the crib, he was trying to warn us? The doctor nodded. It sounds like it. He must have noticed Noah's breathing slowing, even when it wasn't a full apnea episode. He was trying to wake him up. Trying to wake you up. Brian let out a slow breath, shaking his head in disbelief. And we thought he was the problem. Emma covered her mouth with her hand, overwhelmed with guilt. They had almost locked Bruno out of the nursery. They had almost assumed the worst about their guardian angel in golden fur. The doctor gave them a reassuring smile. The good news is that we can manage Noah's condition. We'll set him up with a breathing monitor, and I'll teach you what to watch for. But no matter what, you have Bruno to thank for saving your son's life. Emma looked down at Bruno, who was lying beside her chair, tail gently thumping against the floor.